I've called my paper The Nature of the Qur'ān, and firstly before I start, I want to stress this is really just a work in progress. Secondly, I'd like to thank the organizers for organizing this event, not least David, who proposed this bold Zoom experiment. Now to motivation. Recently, the subject of climate and natural environment has come to the fore in almost all sectors of contemporary life. Indeed, a new sense of urgency has beset the human population on the planet. We no longer recognize ourselves as mere anthropocentric creatures, but has also become creatures of the Anthropocene. This new proposal for a global geological period is associated with a foreboding sense of environmental apocalypse. Demography is yet another term operating with large scales. Around 34% of the world's population are Muslim. According to some estimates, around 1.8 billion people, and with Christians comprising around 33%, some 2 billions. These two Abrahamic religions account for approximately half the world's population. Given these numbers and the fact that large portions of the global population adhere to some kind of religion, the role of religion, whether harmful or beneficial, or both at the same time, ambivalent as David would have said, is hardly negligible. This state of affairs warrant a serious investigation into the theologies that has become such demographic and civilizational successes. The study of Islam, nature and environment has been a subject of its own, gradually growing since the 1970s. But it is only in the new millennium that the field has been trending significantly. With the millennium as the turning point, a scholar of Islam describes two distinct phases, with the pre-millennium yielding the broad overviews of the field with a focus on core Islamic sources like Qur'ān, Hadith, and classical fiqh, Sharia literature. And the new millennial phase has generated studies that connect Islam with specific environmental issues like climate change, desertification, sustainable development, and Muslim eco-activism. Still, new exciting scholarship dealing with the foundational texts and their connection to nature and environment is being published these years. For instance, Anna Gade's very recent Muslim Environmentalism, Religious and Social Foundations. My guess is that we will witness an increased publication rate on this foundational subject the coming years, not least due to the trivial fact that Islam is a highly scriptural religion. Having the Qur'an as the canonical center and point of departure for most other Islamic text genres, further investigations into the links between Qur'an, nature, and environment is still warranted. This said, any correlations and causalities between the deep theology of the Qur'an and its manifestations in the longue durée of human history must, of course, be approached with utmost caution. To deduce from its ultimate sacred postulates and priorities to actual performances is surely one of the most slippery intellectual maneuvers one can do as a student of religion. Likewise, it's a tricky task to deduce from the natural environment and material context to the religious beliefs and priorities. But the ground is somewhat more secure in this regard. Of course, To deduce from, for instance, the landscape of the desert to the concept of monotheism, as earlier scholars sometimes did, is just fanciful and unconvincing. But to deduce from the scorching heat and aridity of the desert to the Qur'an's emphasis on the cooling shadow and the life-giving water is certainly justified. Nature, including that part of nature that humans cultivate and domesticate, for instance gardening, do indeed inform religious language and worldviews. In this paper, I first aim to introduce the subject of nature and environment of the Qur'an. Second, I will outline the most basic semantic domains of the natural world in the Qur'an, such as Flora and Fauna, while comparing it with other basic semantic domains of the Qur'an, such as social and mental domains. The remaining part of the paper will engage with more specific themes of the Qur'anic nature, the first one being the connections between the catastrophic nature, future apocalypse, and the so-called punishment narratives of the past. I also call attention to the neglected topic of seismic catastrophes, that is, the whole part of inanimate nature. Then I will proceed to the living, high nature of animals and vegetation of the Qur'an and interpret their function and meaning in the Quranic universe. And from the Quranic references to inanimate and animate nature in their concrete manifestations, I will finally turn to the semiotic nature of nature, of an environment in the Quran, while adding some thoughts on the hypothesis, or should I say allegation, of anthropocentrism in the Quran. In order to delve into the nature of the Quran, it is worthwhile to outline the overall natural context that set the scene for the emergence of Islam. In the first instance, its geological and geographic environment. As is generally acknowledged, Islam has its roots in the Arabian Peninsula in the western part, specifically in the two cities of Mecca and Medina. Both cities are positioned on the so-called Red Sea escarpment to the west, but close to so-called Al-Hijaz, Asir, and Najd regions. The latter are mountainous highland regions stretching south all the way south to Yemen, as well as to the north. Their Arabic names betray the nature of the environment, Al-Hijaz meaning barrier, Asir meaning difficult, and Najd meaning highland. The peninsula is basically an uplifted plateau comprising of vast sand, rock, and gravel deserts, as well as scarcely and sporadically vegetated steppes. Part of the western region also presents dramatic volcanic landscapes with some seismic and volcanic activity, at times catastrophic, and this is mainly due to the geological rift in the Red Sea between the African continent and the peninsula. The so-called harats, vast fields of black, petrified lava flows and boulders, bear witness to the volcanic environment of the western regions. Medina is situated in this harsh environment and has been on the brink of destruction several times in recorded history. Nonetheless, Medina is also blessed by an oasis milieu, though thus Muhammad's Medina was not only a city but also an agricultural environment, in contrast to Mecca, which probably was much less fertile and was sustained by trading merchants and a pre-Islamic pilgrimage economy. In the Quran, Mecca is described by Ibrahim as a valley where there is no sown land. Beside a contemporary and historical, geographical and ecological assessment of the natural environment of the regions of Mecca and Medina, an assessment by means of the Quranic lexicon, its cache of words, is also worthwhile. One way of approaching the natural Quranic universe is by way of tagging and counting the roots according to their respective semantic domains. In Martin Sammet's A Comparative Lexical Study of Quranic Arabic, Sammet adopts Halleck and Warburg's classification systems and reaches 7 basic semantic domains. For now, I will just specify the subdomains of the natural world in Sammet's book designated as the universe. They are as follows, as you can see on the screen: the sky and the atmosphere, the earth, flora, and fauna. The other domains are as follows: the physical being, the soul and the intellect, man, the social being, social organization, man and the universe, and then, of course, grammatical categories. As Sammet readily acknowledges, such classification schemes entail a certain element of interpretation. Nonetheless, it gives us some kind of rough estimate as to the semantic domains and their distribution. Summing up the main results, the Qur'an yields the following semantic priorities: a semantic hierarchy. Let's not forget that hierarchy means holy rule, something like that. You have man and the universe at the first place, then the soul and the intellect, then physical being, then man, the social being, and then the universe / nature on the 5th place, and then social organization and grammar. The 2 first domains, man and the universe, and the soul and the intellect, constitute almost half of the roots in the Quran. Based on these findings, the common claim that the Quran comprises an anthropocentric universe seems warranted and does not really surprise. Given Islam's strong legal tradition and emphasis on social order of the community, al-Ummah, the 6th place of social organization is, however, somewhat surprising. It could perhaps indicate that the local life world of Muhammad's contemporary community and the life world of post-Muhammadan Islamic empire were, as it were, life worlds apart. As for the domain of our particular interest, the universe with its sky, earth, flora, and fauna, its ranking as the 5th out of 7 seems to confirm my own earlier investigations, into which I argued that the notion and phenomenon of wilderness or wild nature were relatively absent from the Quran. What is more, this ranking of semantic domains allow us to hypothesize that also culture and domesticated nature plays a lesser role in the Quran's total semantic universe. Being in the semantic background, however, does not necessarily indicate that the natural environment is not important. To argue from the inside of Gestalt psychology, without a background, there would be nothing from which the foreground could stand out from, and of course vice versa. If we turn our attention to another study of Quranic semantic domains, Ambrose and Prochaska's The Nouns of Quranic Arabic Arranged by Topics, we will see that, and I won't go through all the topics, I'm already running out of time. We will find that there's more fine-grained ways of categorizing the Quranic environmental universe. But a quick and dirty perusal of the domains seem to indicate that the domains of flora, vegetation, and fauna constitute the richest ones in terms of vocabulary. The seismic Qur'an. In Quranic studies, it's commonplace to describe the Qur'an and early Islam as highly apocalyptic. The Qur'an is indeed a markedly apocalyptic text that depicts remarkable and ominous scenarios of cosmic collapse, human mass death, panic, and other dystopic images. Images of earthquakes, sudden darkness, crumbling mountains, deafening screams, and scorching fragments coming from the sky are central components of the text. In present scholarship, such passages are always interpreted as intertextual adaptations of earlier biblical material, for instance, the Sodom and Gomorrah narratives, and the general apocalyptic mood of late antiquity. I however, have entertained another idea. I argue that the environmental factors should be factored in when explaining the Quran in this respect. In particular, I argue that seismic, volcanic activity may have played a crucial part with regard to the Quran and its language, rhetoric, and the emergence of Islam. Volcanologists estimate that 13 major eruptions have occurred in the past 5,500 years. So this is basically one eruption every 350 years on average. At times, the Quran explicitly depict and lexicalize these seismic events, as in the chapter, for instance, Surah 99, called the earthquake, which starts out with these two lines: when earth is shaken with a mighty shaking and brings forth her burdens. So it's Mother Earth giving birth to a kind of a volcanic eruption. You could also find lots of apocalyptic materials like the lines below. Upon the day when heaven shall be as molten copper and the mountains shall be as plucked wool tufts. To decipher such passages, probably, I argue, demands a basic knowledge of eruptions. For instance, here, the orange coloring of the sky that can occur during eruptions, and at the same time conflated with the image of mountains with whitish ash plumes. In my analysis, the seismic passages and myths of the Quran reveal themselves as kind of proto-scientific observations and collective memories recast in a new monotheist language. Having presented some insights into the structure or dynamics of inorganic and dangerous nature, we can now proceed to organic nature, the Quranic biosphere, comprising various animals and types of vegetation. Although the subject of organic nature, of course, comprises a vast field, the best overview of the role of fauna and flora in the Quran is without doubt again offered by Ambros in his dense and concise article Gestaltung und Funktionen der Biosphäre im Koran, to which the following remarks are very much indebted. Let's start with the fauna. I won't go through all the animals and vocabulary for animals, so I'll just skip those remarks, but let me see, just one moment. Oh yeah, so Summing up the main features regarding animals, they are tested approximately 200 times in the Quran, and they appear in 4 main genres or registers. They appear in legendary material, that is stories related to the past, the pre-Mohammedan past, so to speak. They appear in legal ritual material with regard to food regulation, hunting regulation, and regarding sacrificial animals. They appear in the homiletic passages of the Quran, where the animals, and perhaps that this is the most typical, they serve as examples of God's power, wisdom, and generosity. And finally, in similes, where human beings are compared to animals, and in the majority of examples, in a negative way, as bad, weak, or ignorant. That is both animals and human beings. So compared to the extremely thick and poetic descriptions of wild and domesticated animals in pre-Islamic literature, mainly poetry, the animals are generally superficially described and rarely given an individualized feature. A few times talking animals appear, but most of these occurrences appear in stories that are known from earlier biblical material. Animals are mainly described as utilitarian objects for human beings, objects that a few times are described as beautiful and bestowing its owner a sense of prestige. So when compared to the pre-Islamic poetry and the life world of herding and hunting nomads, the animals of the Quran betray a decidedly urban temper, rather detached from the so-called wild nature. Ambros even portrays the urban atmosphere as that of a middle class, patently indifferent to the aristocratic ethos of the pre-Islamic Arabs, with their ceaseless praises of the camel and their house mounts, their hunting adventures, and their encounters with the wild animals, such as the gazelle, the ostrich, and the lions, totally absent from the Quran. When they come across them in the wilderness. If we now move on to the flora and again immediately sum up the main features, we note that many of them overlap with the features of fauna used in many of the same speech genres and registers. They are useful assets for human beings. However, the language of vegetation seems much more important and complex than fauna. The majority of flora described in the Quran belongs to agricultural crops such as date palms, grain, and fruits. The notion of gardens, you can see some garden here on the page, both earthly and paradisiacal, are noticeable. The Garden of Paradise, with its abundance of sweet water, foliage, fruits, and delicious beverages, and again, no animals, is a hyperbolic version of the enclosed earthly garden, and it stands in stark contrast to the barren, rugged, and boundless landscape of the more or less deadly desert. Repeating the conclusion regarding the social environment of the Quranic Muslims, the aristocratic and wild world of the pre-Islamic nomads seems far away, with its focus on here cultivated products and vegetation. It's of course often intellectually dangerous to pose this or that phenomenon as revolutionary, to present the Quran as a revolutionary event that befell in late antique Arabia within two decades is certainly not prudent scholarship, and several scholars, for instance Toshihiko Isutsu, have called attention to the manifold links between pre-Islamic literature and the Quran. That is how the Quran rehashed and Qur'anized time-honored pre-Islamic vices and virtues. Even more scholars have called attention to the intertextual links between the Quran and the biblical discourse. Nonetheless, the Quran poses a markedly different and differentiating social and environmental world than that of the pre-Islamic semantic universe and ethos. And in that respect, it really marks a revolutionary departure. That probably would have come to pass even without Muhammad. The Quranic life world departs from the wild nature of Arabia and signs up for a much more cultivated and cosmopolitan world of late antiquity. Speaking of signs, let me now move to the final part of my paper, that is how the natural world of the Quran consistently is interpreted in the Quran as a world of signs, ayat, which ultimately should stimulate and prompt the Quranic audience to reflect intellectually and then eventually realize the sovereignty, wisdom, and creative generosity of God. All qualities of God that were to be subsumed under the monotheist heading of Tawheed, God's indivisible oneness. And here you have the Tawheed index finger to symbolize that. A typical formula dovetailing many verses depicting natural phenomena in the Quran are, for instance, this one. These are signs for a people to reflect on, or for people that are wise. Islam is not an ascetic religion. The world is time and again depicted as being full of the good things, at-tayyibat, helpful and sometimes beautiful to human beings. However, the good things tend to dwindle into insignificance when compared to the eschatological world of paradise. For instance, you have a verse here from Surah 6. Decked out fair to men is the love of lusts, women, children, heaped up of heaps of gold and silver, horses of mark, cattle and tillage. That is the enjoyment of the present life. But God, with him, is the fairest resort. And the other example, that which is on earth we have made but a glittering show, sinah, for the earth, so that we may taste them to see which of them is best indeed. Al-Akhirah, the everlasting life world, is clearly more valuable than this transitory world at dunya, and the natural world is merely a utilitarian and aesthetic simulacrum devised to test people, partly in their ethical conduct, partly in their ability to reflect and infer the right monotheist conclusions. This relativization of the natural world matches well with the basic semiotic worldview of the Quran. Just as animals and plants, first and foremost, are worthwhile mentioning due to their practical value for human beings and for their semiotic references to God, the Quranic signs, too, are mere props with which to realize and acknowledge the one and only God. Rephrasing Claude Lévi-Strauss' famous description from his classic The Savage Mind on animals in totemism as good to think with, we could say that the Quran devises a semiotics of natural signs as good to think with. So even though the Quran is patently an anthropocentric text, it is ultimately an anthropocentric text that strives to overcome its own anthropocentrism by way of a thoroughly meta-semiotic rhetoric and worldview, and then become the theocentric text par excellence. I'll give the final word to the Quran itself. And call not upon another God. With God there is no God but He. All things perish except His face. His is the judgment, and unto Him you shall be returned. Thank you for your attention.